The stage lights burned hot over the Capitol's House Judiciary Committee chamber, casting sharp shadows on the long mahogany desk lined with microphones, placards, and posturing. It wasn't just another hearing, it was one of those hearings. C-SPAN was live. Reporters were crammed shoulder to shoulder, phones were recording, and the whole country was watching. At the center of it sat Kash Patel, former chief of staff to the Department of Defense, former prosecutor, trusted Trump ally, calm, composed, and to his critics, dangerous. On the opposite side of the dais sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, fiery, fierce, the rising voice of progressive Democrats, dressed in crimson, notes ready, eyes locked onto Kash with a glare that could shatter glass. She had one mission that day: expose him, humiliate him, and, if possible, end him. Patel knew it the moment he walked in. The hearing was officially about government overreach and national security transparency, but everyone knew it was a political minefield. The Democrats wanted blood. The Republicans wanted fireworks. The media wanted spectacle. Jasmine leaned into her mic, flipping a page of her notes. "Mr. Patel," she began, her tone already acidic, "you've been accused, on record, of defending unlawful behavior in service of a man who treats the Constitution like tissue paper." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Kash blinked once. No smile, just a slight tilt of the head. Jasmine didn't wait. "You call yourself a patriot," she pressed, "but everything in your record suggests you're just another Trump puppet, a foot soldier for chaos." That was it. The room tensed. One staffer coughed. A Republican congressman raised an eyebrow, but Kash stayed silent, letting her words settle into the air like dust. Jasmine leaned back smugly. "You're done," she said flatly. "We've seen through the act," but Kash Patel, still seated, still calm, slowly turned toward her. And then, with the microphone live and the nation listening, he said one word. Kash Patel slowly turned his head, locking eyes with Representative Jasmine Crockett. His face was unreadable, calm, steady, and without even a hint of anger. The room leaned in. Everyone expected a denial, a defensive outburst, maybe even silence. Instead, he leaned toward the microphone and said one word: classified. Just that. But it was enough. Jasmine blinked. Once. Then twice. It wasn't the word she expected. It wasn't no. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't an argument or insult. It was worse. It was a strategic nuke, wrapped in a whisper. The audience didn't know how to respond. Was he dodging? Deflecting? Or dropping something they weren't supposed to touch? Kash leaned back in his chair like someone who'd just fired a silent shot and knew exactly where it would land. Jasmine, recovering quickly, scoffed into her mic. "Classified," she repeated with mockery. "You think you can sit here and hide behind national security every time you're uncomfortable?" Kash didn't respond. He didn't need to, because in that moment something shifted, not in volume, but in power. The word classified wasn't just an answer. It was a challenge. It said, "I know things you don't, and you know I can't say them, but I want the public to ask why." And it worked. Reporters at the back of the room were already scribbling. One whispered to another, "What did he mean by that?" Another texted a headline. "Patel's one-word response leaves Democrats scrambling." Jasmine leaned forward again, trying to regain control. "Let me rephrase then, Mr. Patel. Did you advise the president to withhold troop movements in January 2021? "Classified," he said again, without blinking. Murmurs now swelled. A few Republicans smirked. Even some Democrats looked uneasy. "I see," Jasmine snapped, now visibly irritated. "So we're going to play the secrecy game." Kash finally spoke again, more than one word this time. "No, Congresswoman, I'm not playing any game. I'm respecting the law, something this chamber used to care about." That landed hard. For the first time, Jasmine looked rattled. She glanced at her notes. Pages of questions, now suddenly vulnerable to the same one-word wall. Kash leaned forward again, his voice low but crisp. "You wanted a show," he said. "But I deal in facts. And some of them, you're not cleared to handle." A wave of reaction swept the chamber. Phones lit up. Classified started trending. Jasmine forced a grin. "Fine," she said. "We'll go public with what isn't classified." Kash Patel folded his hands. "I look forward to it." Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for her moment to shine. The word classified had momentarily disrupted her rhythm, but not her will. She wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a trial lawyer. She knew how to pivot. She tapped her stack of papers hard against the desk, microphone still hot. "Well, Mr. Patel," she said, her voice rising a notch, "I may not have clearance, but I have something the American people do: declassified transcripts." She pulled a paper from the stack, holding it high like a trophy. "This, right here, is your January 5th communications log with Acting Secretary Miller." Kash didn't react. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Jasmine smiled wide, mistaking his calm for hesitation. "You claimed no involvement in delaying National Guard approval on January 6th, she said, flipping the document toward the audience. "But this transcript, pages 3 through 7, paints a different story." Murmurs spread across the room. The cameras zoomed in on the stack. Jasmine tapped a passage and read it aloud. "Any DOD directive related to Capitol grounds is to be held until direct White House confirmation." She turned sharply. "That's your voice, isn't it?" A few Democrats nodded. Even some journalists in the room leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. But Kash leaned into the microphone slowly, almost deliberately. "Yes," he said. "That's my voice, and that's my directive. But read the next sentence." Jasmine blinked, caught mid-speech. "What?" Kash gestured calmly. "Go ahead. Page 4, paragraph 2. The part you skipped." Jasmine flipped nervously, eyes scanning. Kash quoted it before she could speak. "And any directive that contradicts operational readiness will be overridden in the event of immediate threat, as assessed by DOD command." The room fell quiet. Kash didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked her dead in the eye and said, "You left that part out." Jasmine shifted in her seat, lips tightening. "And that's the problem with made-for-TV hearings," Kash added. "They edit for impact, not for truth." Reporters were already revising their leads. One headline draft changed mid-keystroke. "Crockett drops DOD bombshell" became "Patel flips hearing with full transcript clause." "You can waive documents all day," Kash said, leaning back again. "But the full story always has a second page." Jasmine tried to speak again, but the moment had turned. He hadn't just blocked her attack. He'd made her look selective. And in D.C., selective was just a prettier word for dishonest. Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, her previous attack diffused midair. The audience wasn't reacting the way she had hoped. Kash Patel hadn't just defended himself. He had exposed the weakness in her narrative. But Crockett wasn't done. She switched strategies. "This isn't just about procedures and transcripts," she said, voice turning colder. "It's about who you serve." Kash folded his hands and waited. Jasmine flipped another page of her notes, carefully highlighting the next line of attack. "You've made it no secret, Mr. Patel, that you're loyal to Donald Trump. In fact, some call you his errand boy, his cleanup crew, his loyalist to the end." The room tensed. "I want to ask you plainly," she continued. "Do you serve the American people, or do you serve one man?" That line landed hard. A few cameras snapped. Even some Republican aides shifted uncomfortably. It was the kind of question designed not to be answered, but to humiliate. Kash took a slow breath. And then, with more clarity than force, he answered, "I swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States." Jasmine rolled her eyes. "A safe answer." Kash leaned in, eyes steady. "No, Congresswoman. A real one. One I still live by." He reached into his folder, not to grab papers, but to pull out a copy of the Constitution, small and worn at the edges. "I've carried this with me since my days as a public defender," he said. "It's not a symbol. It's a map." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. Kash continued, flipping it open. Article 2, Section 2. "The President is the Commander-in-Chief. I advised him under the law, not outside of it. You want to make that loyalty to a man. I call it loyalty to the office, and to order." A long pause followed. Jasmine tried to interject. "You still haven't—" But Kash raised his voice slightly, not in anger, but in finality. "You confuse disagreement with betrayal, and loyalty with blind obedience. I don't follow Trump because of who he is. I follow the law, and the law put him in that chair, twice." Gasps spread in the chamber. He wasn't just defending Trump, he was defending why he served, on a constitutional basis. Reporters shifted from skepticism to intrigue. The clip would be replayed 100 times by morning. Jasmine stared, briefly stunned. Kash quietly folded the pocket constitution and slid it back into his coat. "You may not like who I served," he said, "but I never once betrayed what I swore to protect." Jasmine Crockett was losing patience. The controlled rhythm she entered with had dissolved. Her voice, once sharp and measured, now danced between sarcasm and frustration. "You keep waving that little constitution like it's a shield," she said, eyes narrowing. "But let's talk about something you can't quote from, Mr. Patel. Classified briefings." That word again. The room stiffened. Jasmine pulled out a new folder, red-striped, marked confidential, declassified. A dramatic prop, one she hoped would tip the balance. "This," she said, holding it up, "is your correspondence with the National Security Council, declassified just last month. Pages of selective briefings you leaked to press contacts under the radar. You want to explain that?" Gasps rippled. A few reporters glanced at each other. This was the headline they were waiting for. Kash didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his own folder, produced not a document, but a sleek silver tablet. He placed it calmly on the desk, tapped once, and slid it toward the microphone. "Before I explain anything," he said, "let's clear up who actually leaked what." The tablet screen lit up with a media clip, a video time-stamped, with an MSNBC logo in the corner. Crockett's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" Kash nodded toward the playback. The room listened as Jasmine's own voice filled the chamber from the speakers, lifted from a recent cable appearance. "We've been told Patel handed off briefings to right-wing media before telling Congress. That's an abuse of protocol. Possibly worse." The clip paused. Kash looked directly at her. "You said that on air before reviewing any evidence. Before the declassification date. Which means someone briefed you. Illegally." Jasmine tried to respond, but Kash tapped again. The next clip began. An internal memo, read aloud by a familiar voice, clearly identifying a Democratic aide discussing leaked documents from a staff-only secure call. Now the murmurs grew. One reporter gasped audibly. Another typed furiously. "You brought props," Kash said, his voice steel, "but I brought proof." Crockett's smile faltered. "You're bluffing. That audio was authenticated this morning by congressional IT security. You can call them." He slid the printed verification form across the table like a checkmate. Suddenly, the balance of power had flipped again. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was indicting her entire strategy. "You want to talk about secrets?" he added. "Let's talk about how yours got out." By the time the audio ended, the hearing chamber was no longer just a government room. It was a battlefield. Jasmine Crockett sat frozen, lips parted slightly, eyes flicking toward her staff who scrambled behind her. The very line she'd proudly thrown on MSNBC had become the rope tightening around her own credibility. Outside the building, the scene was transforming fast. Protesters had arrived, two factions. On one side, progressive activists waving signs reading, "Expose the puppets, no more Trump tools." On the other, conservative crowds chanting, "Kash was right, truth over theater," and in a new twist, one freshly printed sign reading, "One word, classified." Inside, the hearing was in chaos, but not loud. The sound had vanished, because after Kash's audio drop, silence was the loudest thing in the room. Cameras stayed fixed. Reporters hesitated to even breathe too loud, afraid to miss the next shift. Jasmine tried to regain footing. She cleared her throat, voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Patel, I'm not here to play games with edited recordings." But Kash leaned in. "No editing, no narration, just your words, and that aide's words. Shall I play more?" Jasmine held up a hand, attempting to look composed. "This hearing isn't about me." Kash raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe you shouldn't have made it personal." A slow, quiet clap started near the back. One congressional observer unable to resist. It quickly died, but the moment had registered. Crockett switched gears, again. "Fine," she said, pulling herself straighter, voice firming. "Let's stop the theater. Let's talk national security. You say you respect the Constitution, then answer this. Did President Trump authorize you to bypass formal intelligence procedures? The question hung heavy. Kash didn't blink. I can't answer that in this setting. Another wave. You mean it's classified? She said, sarcasm cutting deep again. No, he said evenly. I mean it would require closed session. You want answers? Set the proper stage. The crowd murmured again. Because he wasn't refusing. He was inviting, and that made it worse for her. Social media had caught up. On X, the top 3 trending hashtags were now. One word classified, Crockett cornered. Kash did not blink. Clips of the audio were already going viral. Conservative accounts were praising his calm. Even neutral commentators began to admit Kash Patel had flipped the room. Jasmine checked her phone discreetly beneath the table. 2 missed calls from her media advisor, and one text that just read, "We're losing the narrative." She looked up, and across the table, Kash Patel sat with hands folded, perfectly still. He hadn't raised his voice once, but somehow, she had already lost hers. Jasmine Crockett's hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles whitening. The script she'd come in with, clear, dominant, bulletproof, was unraveling in real time. Her momentum had evaporated, her offense twisted back onto itself. But she wasn't about to walk away, not without trying to swing back. She leaned toward the mic, voice rising, her frustration now impossible to hide. "You think being calm makes you honest, Mr. Patel?" she barked. "You sit there smug, dodging with classified and pre-recorded games. But you haven't answered a single real question." Kash Patel didn't respond. She pressed harder. "Do you think loyalty to one man is above loyalty to your country? Do you think hiding behind closed session excuses makes you clean?" Still nothing from him. Not a word. Not a blink. Only eye contact. Unbroken, unshaken. The silence made it worse. Jasmine slammed her hand on the table. "Answer me!" The chamber jumped. Staffers stirred. Even Chairman Nadler looked up from his phone. But Kash Patel simply adjusted his collar. When he finally spoke, it was not loud. It was calm. Calm enough to cut through all of it. "I didn't come here to yell." He waited. "You did." Another pause, and then, "I came to tell the truth, and I don't need volume to do that." The words landed like a slow-falling hammer. Jasmine froze, not because she had nothing to say, but because whatever she had left suddenly sounded small. Kash continued, tone steady. "When you have facts, you don't need theatrics. When you've done nothing wrong, you don't need to shout over silence." Phones recorded every word. The audience barely blinked. The only sound in the room was the dull buzz of fluorescent lighting, and the slow burn of a woman realizing she was no longer leading the room. "You said I'm done," Kash added finally, then leaned forward. "But we're not done. Not yet." Kash Patel reached calmly into the folder he hadn't yet opened. It was thinner than the others, leather-bound and sealed with a brass clip. He placed it on the desk like a closing argument in a courtroom, and the room leaned in. Even Jasmine Crockett, visibly tense now, lowered her voice. "What is that?" Kash unclipped it without fanfare. "This," he said, "is a certified timeline, submitted by the Department of Defense Inspector General, showing the exact communication flow between myself, the White House, and Capitol Police. On the day you claim I was stalling National Guard approval." He turned to the clerk. "I request it be entered into the record." Nadler hesitated, but nodded. "Without objection, so entered." Patel didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. He slid the first page toward the cameras. Highlighted in bold were 3 entries. 1:10 p.m. Patel authorizes readiness coordination. 1:22 p.m. White House confirms troop alignment. 1:37 p.m. Capitol Police leadership declines deployment, pending further assessment. Jasmine stared, blinking. Kash turned the second page. "Here's the part your team has never acknowledged," he said. "Internal emails between Capitol Police and House leadership show hesitation, not from DOD, but from inside this building." He paused, then looked directly at Jasmine. "You framed me as the delay, but the paper trail points to your side's indecision." Murmurs turned into gasps. Reporters dropped their phones trying to type fast enough. Social media exploded again. Hashtag Patel timeline and hashtag who delayed. The guard surged within seconds. Jasmine opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Her fingers gripped her papers, but the pages suddenly seemed hollow. Patel let the silence linger. "You called it chaos," he said softly. "I call it evidence." She shifted in her seat, not to speak, but to regroup. Her usual fire had dimmed, not from exhaustion, but from impact. Kash gently tapped the brass clip closed. "You said I was done," he added. "But I think the country just saw who actually froze when it mattered." And with that, for the first time that day, Jasmine Crockett had no comeback. By the time Kash Patel finished speaking, the chamber wasn't just silent, it was paralyzed. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her papers untouched, her hands finally still. But outside the four walls of the hearing room, the impact was detonating like a political bomb. Within minutes, the hearing clip hit every platform. Fox News broke in with live coverage. Newsmax labeled it, "The Day Patel Shut Congress Down." But what no one expected was CNN cutting mid-panel to replay the hearing's final minute. "You said I was done, but I think the country just saw who actually froze when it mattered." That line, now viral, lit up TikTok, X, and YouTube Shorts. Memes were instant. Reaction videos from across the spectrum poured in. Conservative influencers dubbed him the Quiet Storm. Others went further. "This is the Gen X warrior they didn't see coming." Even traditionally liberal pundits couldn't ignore it. MSNBC's Joy Reid paused during a segment and admitted, "Say what you will, but that man came prepared, and he left a mark." Across Capitol Hill, the fallout began. A leaked group text from Jasmine's campaign team read, "This got out of hand fast. Pull back media appearances. Reframe now." Another aide texted her chief of staff, "We need to shift the narrative, or sit her down." Meanwhile, Kash Patel's phone lit up like wildfire. Former White House officials, current House Republicans, and even one moderate Democrat sent short messages. "You just made history, damn. Stay ready. The pressure's coming." And they were right. Because while Kash had dominated the moment, he'd also painted a target on his back. Crockett's team scrambled to issue a public statement, but it read defensive. "Today's hearing reflects deeper concerns about national security and political showmanship. We remain focused on the facts." The comments under the post told a different story. "Too late. Patel buried you." Facts? He brought them. Kash remained quiet. For now. He sat in a private conference room with his legal advisor, phone off, eyes steady. "You said what you needed to," the advisor said. Kash nodded. "I didn't go there to win," he said quietly. "I went to remind them I'm still here." But he'd done more than that. He'd exposed fractures, not just in Crockett's argument, but in the illusion of control Washington thought it still had. The hearing was over. The gavel came down, but the echoes of what had just unfolded refused to fade. Reporters poured into the halls like a tidal wave, cameras in hand, questions flying. But only one figure everyone chased down the corridor. Kash Patel. Jasmine Crockett didn't stop for press. She slipped out a side door, trailed by her aide, her jaw clenched and her eyes fixed on the floor. No post-hearing statement, no defiant headline, just a quiet retreat. The sound bites belonged to someone else now. A crowd had gathered outside the Capitol. Chants rose in the chilly air. One word. He flipped the room. "We want the tape." Kash stepped outside, flanked by two aides, met by a wall of microphones. But instead of rushing to speak, he took a moment. A deep breath. No notes, no script, just the calm that had defined him all day. One reporter shouted, "Mr. Patel, any regrets about today's hearing?" Kash turned to the camera. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. "I regret that this is what it takes to be heard." Another asked, "What would you say to Congresswoman Crockett right now?" He paused, then looked directly at the lens. "I'd say the truth doesn't need to yell. It just needs to outlast the noise." That line hit harder than any headline. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. Reporters fell silent, scribbling furiously. Even the network stopped cutting away. For once, the story was about restraint, not rage. Calm, not chaos. And Kash Patel, the man Jasmine called a puppet, had just puppeteered the entire moment. Hours later, Every major outlet ran the clip. The framing was undeniable. Crockett raised her voice, but Patel raised the bar. Trump ally brings receipts, leaves opponent speechless. Meanwhile, Jasmine's team released a bland statement hours later. Today's exchange reflected the passion of our democratic process, but no one reposted it. The internet had already chosen the moment to remember, not the fire, but the silence that followed it. Kash Patel stood beneath the Capitol dome that night, alone for a moment as aides dispersed. He looked up toward the darkening sky. He didn't smile, but he didn't need to. Because when she screamed, "You're done," the nation waited to see if he would fold. Instead, he turned and said one word that changed everything. They told Kash Patel he was done. They underestimated his silence, his precision, and his one-word answer that rewrote the entire hearing. In a world where shouting often drowns out the truth, today was a reminder that calm doesn't mean weak, and loud doesn't mean right. Jasmine Crockett walked in expecting a puppet, but the only strings pulled were hers. This wasn't just a clash of politics. It was a clash of presence, of facts, of who really controls the moment when the cameras are rolling. And when the nation looked for a voice of reason in the chaos, he didn't shout. He whispered the truth, and the country heard it loud and clear. If you felt that impact, share this video. And if you're ready for more moments they don't want you to see, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because next time, it might not just be a hearing, it might be a reckoning.